Phronesis. Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this beautiful world. My name is Scott Allen, and I am the host of Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. I am an associate professor of management at John Carroll University in Cleveland, Ohio, USA. I'm an author, an entrepreneur, a speaker, a nonprofit founder, and the host of 2 podcasts. I'm also a husband and dad of 3. You just heard from Kate, my daughter, who wrote and performed the Phronesis intro. Phronesis offers a smart, fast-paced discussion on all things leadership. My guests are scholars and practitioners, and we cover timely, relevant topics and incorporate practical tips designed to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. Now, I am proud to share that Phronesis is the official podcast of the International Leadership Association, an association that is near and dear to my heart. ILA brings together leaders and those who teach, study, and develop leadership, advancing leadership knowledge and practice for a better world. Learn more at ilaglobalnetwork.org. If you like what we're up to, please click subscribe so you can stay up to date as we release new episodes each week. You can also share what we're up to with others. And now, today's show. Good day, everybody. Welcome to Phronesis. Today, I'm honored to have Dr. Chellie Spiller, and she is a professor at University of Waikato's Management School and Associate Dean Māori. She has a passion for leadership, Māori and Indigenous business and governance, wisdom, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, and sustainable business. She is a committed advocate for Māori leadership, management, governance, and business development. And her latest book, it has practical wisdom in the title, and that's in the title of my podcast, Chellie. So I'm excited. And it's Practical Wisdom, Leadership and Culture, Indigenous, Asian, and Middle Eastern Perspectives. Now, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. What would you like to share with listeners about you before we begin? And then we can start our topic for the day.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd really like to start with a Māori greeting to all the listeners. So, kia ora koutou, kei te mihi mahana kia koutou, e ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā hau e whā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. What that means is warm greetings, everyone, from the Pacific, and I'm acknowledging all the mana, all the dignity, all the authority, all the languages, and the people of the 4 winds that have gathered here to listen to this podcast, Scott.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. Well, and tell listeners about you. What should we know that wasn't in the little brief bio that I read?
Right. Well, I am Professor of Leadership at the University of Waikato in Hamilton, New Zealand. I have what you would describe as bicultural heritage. So on my mother's side, I'm Indigenous Māori. So I come from a long line of very staunch Māori warrior women. And on the other side, I come from British heritage through my father. So I guess it's very much shaped and informed my work in leadership, and that passion and that advocacy that you mentioned. In particular, I've really had to navigate those worldviews as they've often collided in the household and in myself. And I guess my work has been one of coming to a deeper understanding of cultures, worldviews, and how we can move forward from that place. So it's working at the interface, we would call it.
Chellie, would you talk a little bit about that? Talk a little bit about some of those interfaces that you've had to, in some cases, maybe reconcile. Maybe they haven't been reconciled. But what are some of those interfaces?
Well, I think the Māori side for me is the only, part that I've really known, because my British grandparents never made it to New Zealand, and my Irish grandfather passed away before I got to know him. So I've been very deeply steeped in the Māori worldview, and that for me is a worldview that's built on relationships. It's very warm, it's very culturally grounded, and it's very different to the wider Western perspective. So how that shows up in my own life as I, really wanted to go out and see the world as most Kiwis do. We really want to have our big OE, our overseas experience, and got out, and I had my first experience was as a AFS or American Field Scholar in Thailand for 1 year, and that really opened up new perspectives for me. And from there, I eventually made my way back to New Zealand after spending some 15 years in Australia. Did a Master's in International Relations, a Ph.D. in Māori Business, and then I went to Harvard. And that was a turning point for me, Scott, because at Harvard, I met the people who were working on the Native American Indian, Harvard Project on Native American Economic Development under the guidance of Professor Joe Colt and Stephen Cornell. And then I really got to see what was happening in Indian country, the incredible things that were taking place, and I brought that knowledge back and into my work.
We'll talk about your work because it's extensive, it's prolific. So what are some themes that have emerged from that work that you would love to share with listeners? What should we know about that stream of research?
Right. Well, I'm very focused on wellbeing economies. So in New Zealand, we our Treasury, our Reserve Bank, is committed to a wellbeing economy. So around the idea that GDP is such an insufficient way of measuring the health of an economy. And that aligns really beautifully with Māori ideas around a wellbeing economy, which has been a steadfast view of how Indigenous peoples view prosperity. And it really means, it taps into the idea that I think one of the key things that travels across Indigenous cultures is this idea of sacred kinship with all of creation. That when, for example, in Māori worldview, we have a word called whakapapa, which means genealogy, and we trace our genealogy right back to a single point of origin, a coalescence point, as it were, where we see ourselves as literally related to all of creation, to rocks, trees, sentiency and everything. And when you're moving from that, what I would call a root ontology, it really changes the way that we look at our role as stewards in this world.
Yes. It totally reframes it.
It totally reframes it. So whereas, say, perhaps the Western culture is needing to rehabilitate in some way because of the Cartesian split, industrialization, globalization, in spite of the incredible disruptions of colonization on many Indigenous peoples, they've retained this continuity of belief through their cultural transmissions, through ceremony, ritual, that's been passed from one generation to the next. So there's this continuity of being in the world in which we are custodians of the planet. And that really changes the way leadership is enacted, governance is carried out. And I'm really, really excited by what happens. In spite of all the disruptions that go on, we see people in all kinds of situations taking into consideration the well-being of the environment, the well-being of communities. Their spiritual well-being is really important, as well as economic growth and development. And sometimes they have to make conscious compromises, but they do that consciously. It's not rampant, unfettered growth.
The whole notion of a custodian, again, just reframes our time, our work, our purpose versus, I think, what at times we can default into, which is consumer. I take, and I consume. And it's not that mindset of a custodian. Again, it broadens the perspective.
Yes. It definitely broadens it. And it very much is an intergenerational view as well. So it isn't just about, the now generation or us and our comfort and our lifestyle. Of course, we all want comfortable lifestyles, but from an Indigenous point of view, you'll see these communities planning some 500 years out. So they have these intergenerational plans because it's really important that as ancestors of tomorrow, that we're handing over, assets, and I use that word in terms of, the land, the environment, community, the social fabric, that everything is handed over in a better shape than when we received it. So our task as leaders, as people in governance or whatever we're doing, our task is to make sure the next generation is better than us. And we look to the past generations for guidance, because the kinds of values that have been passed down through the generations are values that teach us how to be in intimacy with the world, how to be in really good relationship with the world. So it's not just like a nostalgic retreat to the past. This is a living, dynamic, adaptive system, what I call a consciously adaptive system.
What are some of the, Chellie, what are some of the interfaces, similarities between conceptions of leadership and maybe, the Western kind of notion of what a leader is, and some of the indigenous perspectives on the topic of leadership? Are there similarities in some cases? And then maybe what are some of the, we've talked about potentially some of the differences, a wider perspective. It's not simply the bottom line. It's long-term and intergenerational. It's not next quarter.
And of course, you'll see many, Western businesses with that mindset as well. Circular economy, sustainable business, where they are looking for much longer-term views intergenerationally themselves. They're looking to create multidimensional wellbeing, not simply chasing a profit. There's some connectedness, I guess, around, when you look at stakeholder theory, but the difference perhaps being that Indigenous communities have stakeholders in perpetuity, so there's no free entry and exit of stakeholders. So that's one kind of difference. I guess in terms of leadership theory, we might say that relational, collective, shared, distributed leadership, there is a resonance there with Indigenous approaches to leadership. But I ardently believe we cannot shoehorn Indigenous leadership theory into Western theories. The best that Western theories can do is illuminate some aspect of Indigenous leadership, because Indigenous leadership is a whole belief system, a whole philosophy, ontology, and it's a way of life. So it can't really be fragmented and understood through the lens of Western theory. So, we try to use Western theory around leadership just to illuminate aspects of what's going on in the Indigenous world. What are some of the other tensions? Sometimes the differences aren't massive. They're just a question of emphasis. But in our classes with Māori and other Indigenous students, we really help them navigate those tensions at that interface in between, because they're not living in silos. They have to navigate different worldviews. Sometimes it's easier to be either or, not both and. So the real challenge is, how do we move forward in the complexities, the nuance, the ambiguities, the tensions of that interface, and make wise decisions?
How do you think about that, moving forward through those tensions? In your experience, what has been the best approach in navigating those?
Sometimes it's out and out activism.
Okay, good.
So, one thing about the courage and resilience that, has kept Indigenous ways of being, livelihoods, outlooks going is just the sense of we will not be crushed. And in spite of huge adversities, you'll see these communities, staying steadfast. But to do that, they really have had to step up and speak out and really take action. So in America, we've got the Yen Collective. Over here, a kind of an international case study was when the Wanganui River was given legal personhood. Now, that has happened through Indigenous leadership from one generation to the next, battling in the courtrooms to ensure that the river was seen as a living entity, an indivisible living entity that no one can own, and that the local Māori are custodians and they have a deep relationship with that river. So all of these things come about because of, yes, dialogue is a part of that, Scott, but it really has required resistance and activism as well. And we wrote a paper that was published in Human Relations last year. We called it Paradigm Warriors. And we go right back to the roots of Māori, in this case, as paradigm warriors who really step forward and are prepared to overturn the status quo in service of a better world and a better life. And that takes courage, and it takes humility, and it takes intergenerational belief.
Well, yes. I mean, I'm sure sometimes it takes legal action. In some cases, it takes activism. And I mean, it's probably across the board as to how we facilitate change and how we facilitate change. I mean, it's incredibly difficult work.
Standing Rock Sioux, is another great example of, people coalescing around the Dakota Pipeline and wanting to keep communities safe, but also the environment protected. And there was just such a gathering of Indigenous people and allies from all walks of life coming together to support Standing Rock Sioux in their endeavour.
Well, I think I watched a documentary over the weekend, which was called LFG. And I can't say what that stands for because there's a swear word in there. But it's about the U.S. women's soccer team that really, to advance their notion of equal pay, had to sue U.S. soccer because they weren't stepping up and they weren't doing what was right and providing equal pay for equal work. So yes, I mean, there's so many different levers from which to kind of choose as far as how to facilitate change. But you're right, activism and the danger and the struggle and the persistence, even in this one simple documentary, or I watched another documentary over the weekend about the civil rights movement in the United States. There's fear, there's violence, there's so much embedded in shifting the culture and doing what's right, unfortunately, right?
Yes, we had a special issue in leadership that came out earlier this year, and it was on race and leadership. And in one of those papers, we explored the idea of silence as well, all the different forms of silence around these really tricky topics. They're tough topics to talk about sometimes, and because they're so difficult and fraught, people can feel uncomfortable very quickly, and so they keep silent about it, not because they're filled with loathing or hate, but it's just too uncomfortable to talk about. They don't feel safe. They're worried about saying the wrong thing. So I really encourage people to become allies, to learn more, to connect, to watch those documentaries, and to be willing to be opened up and go on a journey of discovery to learn more about Indigenous leadership, in particular race and leadership. And in that journey of discovery, it may not be comfortable, and it may require some kind of fragmenting. I love that word discover, because to discover means to discover, to break up, to fragment in some way. But as Leonard Cohen said, that's how the light gets in, and that's how we gain new perspective, is by being willing to get uncomfortable, to learn and break up and open up our worldview.
So what are some other, I love how you framed, I'm kind of going backwards a little bit in our conversation, but I loved how you framed that, you can't even really separate leadership from the whole. Would you talk a little bit more about the whole? What are some ways of being in the whole? Does that make sense, my question?
Yes, well, yeah. I think it does. We'll find out shortly. Yes, well, Māori, a Māori relational approach is about holism. In a way, I use this word sphere intelligence. Sphere intelligence includes our interiority, our spiritual well-being, our relationships with the world, with all of creation, and we're trying to really look at all elements of a situation. So it's kind of, it's sort of taking creative intelligence, our intuition, reading the signs in the environment and in people, as well as our rational logic, of course. But we're not getting stuck in those corridors of rational logic, straitjacketed into having to make decisions based on what spreadsheets tell us, or, just a very limited aspect of our intelligence. So I make the difference between sphere intelligence and then square intelligence. Square intelligence being all those cells and spreadsheets, that rationalistic logic that can really dictate our path, instead of stepping back, pausing, and just having that time to reflect and look around and tap into the wisdom within us as well. So I think, we can get really caught up sometimes in leadership roles in that square world. And the invitation of Indigenous holistic thinking is to enter a spherical world that's more rounded, where we show up as whole people. And I guess it is that world of both and. It's more interwoven, relational. It's about the group relationships, group harmony and group accomplishments, process orientation. And I guess if you contrast that to sometimes the Western worldview, and I don't like generalizing because it's unfair, because so many people, colleagues, especially in the leadership space, they're not entirely individualistic. But if we were just for a moment say, well, the Western world has really uplifted the idea of the individual, the self, and the analysis of parts and reductionism, personal achievement can be quite linear sometimes. This is where we're going to go, and goal conquering, deadline orientation. So I think those are some of the ways in which we try and navigate. And we use this word ambicultural, which is taking the strengths of all, and really trying to be ambidextrous in the way that we want to move in the world, and use the strengths of all cultures to make really wise decisions in service of the future, the ecology and communities.
Beautifully said. You answered. That was beautifully said. Would you talk a little bit about New Zealand? Obviously received a lot of press across the world in recent months, over the last 18 months, because of how it reacted to COVID-19. And, as a leadership scholar, and again, you have these many interfaces and different communities and different perspectives, whether that's higher education. And how did you experience that from a leadership standpoint? Did you feel like that it was a leadership win for Jacinda Ardern, or did you feel that it was, how did you experience it? I mean, what was your lived experience of that 16, 18 months? And I'm sure we're still immersed in it on some level.
Yes, it's still unfolding. And of course, our borders are, quite shut, and only a relatively small portion of the population's been vaccinated, I think 500,000 as we speak. Well, I do feel that my sense of Jacinda's leadership was really appropriate and relevant right throughout. Right from the beginning, she was decisive. She also really made it clear that this was a collective endeavour. She used terms like team of 5 million. It was very distributed in the sense that it felt like everyone was taking personal responsibility, and if they weren't, they were quickly outed. So that, this language of a team of 5 million came through. To be kind to each other was very much a word that Jacinda was using last year, to be kind, to be safe. So I think that resonated and rippled right throughout the New Zealand population. Standing beside her was Dr. Ashley Bloomfield, so Fauci's counterpart, I guess, in New Zealand. And they did a survey on his leadership style, and 78% of respondents said that his style was very humble, clear, unambiguous. And so I feel too that he embodied a really important style of leadership around, maybe that's his scientific, his medical training, but he had strong composure and this humbleness that I think Kiwis really appreciate. And we also saw Māori leaders. Some of them stepped up and they put up roadblocks to stop people entering into different regions. And that was, controversial, because some people said, you can't breach my rights by putting up a roadblock. But they did. And I think this comes back to this idea of courage again. And they were doing that to protect vulnerable populations inside these territories, not just Māori, but all people, because in some of these regions, the health is poorer than in others. So, they just took decisive action too. So I think there's so many examples of leadership across the country, both small and big, that collectively it felt like a very safe place to be.
Well, Brad Jackson, he kind of described it as, people rowing in the same direction, And of course, there were some people who were not. But if you have enough rowing in the same direction, then, and we had a wonderful conversation about place. I mean, he's so focused on some of that work around place. And I've even heard some of that in how you've spoken today, that place is critical and it's important and it's essential to be cognizant of. I loved, and I'd never thought of a river. Explain that again. It was a river that was given rights. It was a river that was seen as an individual. I love that.
Yeah, it was given legal personhood. So it's got equal rights akin to a person. It's a phenomenal precedent. And, so it's seen as an indivisible and living whole. It's about 290 kilometres long. And its own journey has been a troubled one as well as a river. It's been partitioned off, it's been sold, it's had the gravel extraction, it's had, chemicals pouring into it, it's been polluted. Its life force, what we call the modi, the life force of that river, was treated very cruelly. And so for this river itself to be set free from the dominion of industrialization, as well as, we're not just looking at it in terms of people's right to be custodians of that river. We're looking at it in terms of that river's right to be well. And I think it's, it's a courtroom battle. It's been happening since the 1800s. But one generation of Māori leaders after the next took up that baton and carried on the fight, so that the river, could return to wellness again, and its modi return to balance.
That's an incredible story. Has that been written about? Has that story been told?
It has been told, and from what I understand, India and Bangladesh have now started endowing rivers with legal rights, with legal personhood as well. And imagine if that was amplified all around the world, and our waterways were brought to wellbeing again, so that they could be the living entities that they are. And this comes back to, to place, that we really care about our place, and we care about not just the tangible aspects of it, but the intangible, the spiritual wellbeing, the life force of our places that we live in. It really changes the relationship. It's not just a stakeholder. It's this idea of co-evolution, that humans and place are co-evolving together in symbiotic relationships.
Yes, and if the humans have that broader perspective of what that means, that can be incredibly powerful. And unfortunately,
well, it is, because it comes back to our deep sense of belonging. To belonging not only to our families, our friends, our communities, but belonging to place and belonging to the world, to the planet as well. So it really deepens this idea of what it means to belong. And in some recent research, I've been looking at Ravelli's work on quantum physics, and he talks about relational quantum and the idea that nothing exists outside of relationship. That's kind of an indigenous way of looking at things. That we self-actualize in relationship. So I would have thought, in a way, these conversations that people like Ravelli are having around relational quantum is really interesting, because it's sort of like a form of a root ontology, I would call it, that indigenous peoples, they know that interconnectedness, interdependency, this relational aspect. And when you've got science saying, nothing exists outside of relationship.
There you go. Right? Well, you said recent. What else have you been thinking about recently or writing about recently? What's been on your radar?
Following this thread, I guess, of consciousness. So I am consciousness and leadership. They had a special issue on, critical views of authentic leadership. And I wrote a short piece, a thought piece for that, and really looked at this idea of Indigenous I am consciousness. So moving from the authentic self and kind of critiquing that from the level of, when we look at to thine own self be true, which came out of Shakespeare, Polonius, self-centeredness, narcissism, and then saying, well, what does it mean from an Indigenous perspective to conceive of the self? and this view of I am, and that we understand ourselves in relationship to everything around us, including ancestral lines, including, our whakapapa, as I said, our genealogy. So I think to frame it from a Māori perspective, when we introduce ourselves to each other, Scott, we say our pepeha. So I would describe myself as, ko taumiti te maunga, ko mangatahi te moana, ko mangapoike te awa, ko Ngāti Kahungunu, ki Wairoa te iwi. And it's a really short one, and they go on for much longer than that. But it's basically saying, this is my sacred mountain. This is my sacred ocean. This is my sacred river. You will know me through this place, through these places that I belong to, that I'm sharing with you right now. And this is how we introduce ourselves to each other. We don't just go, hi, I'm Chellie and I'm a professor at the University of Waikato, and name our title. Those are the last things we mention. I wouldn't even mention the title, by the way. I'd mention my name, but not the title. That's not what's important. What's important is this way that I have emerged from place and belong to place, and my kinship relations. So this idea of whakapapa is right across the Indigenous world. But in this particular paper, I also look at ancient Celtic poet Imogen, and he was a mystic seer on the Milesian fleet as they entered Ireland, and he casts out this poem, and it's the most beautiful poem, which resonates with a Māori perspective very much. And I'll just
please
pause and get it. We held a workshop in London some years ago, and we opened up, with everybody exploring their pepeha and sharing themselves in this way. And right from the beginning, people were crying. It was right in the heart of an industrial estate in the heart of London. We had physicists, Eritreans, we had people from all walks of life, Huguenot background, and we just felt like we were in this bubble of time where people were sharing from this really deep place. And some months after that workshop, I received an email from people saying that it was just so special for them, and that they were tracing their lineage, going off on journeys across the world, really, to discover their roots.
Well, even when you introduced yourself, I got goosebumps. I mean, it's just so powerful. It's a more holistic, it's a sphere.
Yeah, and it's just one of the most simple things, and yet the most profound. And, I hold all kinds of workshops, and just taking that time to sit with each other in a circle and hear the story of a person, the journey that their ancestors took, the wisdom that's been transmitted, the places that they belong to. And it just, you just start to see a person really differently. It's such a sacred thing to be doing and to be giving it, all that airtime. We had some Chinese leaders one year, and it was like, we call it the meeting of the dragon and the taniwha. The taniwha's, Māori way of looking at that. And I remember spending, we were planning this encounter between Māori leaders, Chinese leaders, and it was for a whole day. And everyone was sitting in a circle in the boardroom, kind of sitting low. And the whole day was taken up by introductions and just getting to know each other, hearing each other's background stories. And that relationship building is very common across Indigenous as well as many Asian societies and cultures, is taking that time to really establish trust and understand values. So shall I read out this poem? So it's an invocation by the legendary poet seer, Imogen, and it was spoken sometime between 400 and 700 BC when he first set foot upon Ireland as part of the Milesian fleet. So it's been called by some as the first Irish poem. I am wind on sea. I am wave upon land. I am ocean roar. I am stag of seven fights. I am hawk on cliff. I am teardrop of the sun. I am fairest of plants. I am boar for valour. I am salmon in a pool. I am lake on plain. And when I first read that poem, like every part of me just started to kind of tingle, because I recognised this ancient way of expressing who we are in this world, and that sense of belonging and relationship and respect and mutuality coming through in him. And then, of course, in the same paper, I look at an African view of this as well, and you'll see across all these different cultures this extraordinary way of invoking ourselves and consciousness. And I think it's really, exciting. It's not the easiest route. I think it, as I say in the article, it requires leaders to go beyond the ruts of the daily grind in the grooves of ourself and hold a more expansive, healing, connective vision for humanity. Because more than ever, we really need leaders who are willing to take up this bigger, larger, more holistic way of leading and truly commit to their own journey in that process.
There's just so much knowledge and wisdom. I published an episode on Plato and Aristotle and Machiavelli 3 or 4 weeks ago. And it was a really fun conversation because it's a source of knowledge, right? But I think we are missing out on incredible wealths of perspectives and important voices that are critical to our future. And mindsets and ways of thinking. Again, the notion of the sphere, it's expansive. It's holistic. It's not one-dimensional. And I think sometimes in the West, our thinking can be very one-dimensional. What is the bottom line? Well, they were a great leader because they produced shareholder value. And okay, one dimension, but what is that doing to that river, to your point? I live in a community, Cleveland, Ohio, where our river was on fire a few times. And that's what we were producing. I just really, really appreciate your perspective.
And I'm a big believer that we all have this DNA throbbing in our veins, and that it's, for many people, it may be a great returning. But I do sense a huge longing around the world for things to be different and to get out of that trap, I guess. And to talk about leadership, in terms of shareholder value, of course, there are people who can be really successful in leadership when for a certain period of time. But what we often see is that when those leaders leave those organisations, everything can start to fray and fall apart. So from an Indigenous perspective, that is not successful leadership. Successful leadership is, success is succession when you're making the next generation of leaders better than oneself. And we're really taking care of our environment, our people, well-being at all levels. That is successful leadership. So we do need to look at our measures of, what success looks like in that bottom line, which is still very dominant, and GDP is still very dominant. So, take my hat off to the New Zealand government for, moving towards being a well-being economy and reframing, moving from pure wealth, as in W-E-A-L-T-H, to wealth, W-E-L-T-H, which is an old English word for well-being, and it's really saying we are committed to the well-being of our people and our environment.
Chellie, what have you been listening to or streaming or reading? It may have something to do with what we've been discussing. It may have nothing to do with what we've been discussing. But what have you been consuming that's caught your eye as of late?
Carlo Rovelli's latest book came out just recently, and I can't for a second say I understand it. But there's all these bits that I feel I resonate with. But my reading is really quite wide. I'll look at my Kindle and I can tell you exactly what I've been reading. I just read a fantastic book by Kazuo Ishiguro, and it's Clara and the Sun, and I really, really enjoyed that. And then following on from that, Matt Haig, The Midnight Library. So, because at nighttime, I try and switch
my
off.
wife just finished that book. She loved it.
It's really cool. It fitted so beautifully to the whole quantum thing too.
I've been reading Something Deeply Hidden by Sean Carroll, which is kind of the many worlds theory of quantum. And again, I don't understand half of it. But I too have a fascination. I wish I would have paid more attention. It happened when Pythagorean's theorem was introduced for me and numbers became letters. And then all of a sudden the guy upstairs just shut down. And I wish that wouldn't have happened because I have so much love and appreciation for physics and quantum mechanics, and I want to learn it. I'm not there yet.
Yeah, I'm definitely not there, but I love this idea of ancient cosmologies. And I think for me, that's where what Carlo Ravelli, and his book was called Helgoland, and I look at Sean's work, is this idea that, of relationships. And when we look at the Dogon priests of Mali, the Babylonians, the ancient Egyptians, Māori, there's this kind of sense that there's a parent cosmology that's been laid down, and it's travelled through time alongside us, and it hasn't been entirely ruptured or forgotten. And so I'm really interested in some of these ancient notions. Like in Māori, we have this te kore kore, which is the void. And it's a void of potential from which all things emerge. So coming back to leadership, we have I te kore ki te pō ki te ao marama, from the void into the night and into the world of light. So the task for leadership is to release more light into the world, into te ao marama, the world in which we inhabit. But to do that, we're reaching into te kore, that void. And when you start to look at quantum, and you've got plenitude, possibilities, emptiness, voids, infinite, sort of possibilities, and then you're like, wow, this is really cool. I don't understand it, but it's cool. Yeah.
But you know what? That's how all of us continue to learn, grow, develop, and stretch ourselves, because I love being in conversations where I understand half of what's being said, and then maybe next time I understand 55%. I just kind of stick at it.
And I guess that's the scholarly inquiry, isn't it? It's a world of curiosity and inquiry and being stretched. And I don't know about you, Scott, but I think one of our occupational hazards is our brains just so busy. So I do try and read things that don't trigger my mind in the evening so much, just more like kind of gentle and less active. And of course, getting out into the world and walking and, letting nature be the healer and the recalibrator is absolutely vital to my well-being.
So well said. Well, Chellie, it's been so wonderful meeting you today. Thank you very, very much for joining me and helping me better understand your work. I can't wait to explore this topic. How can people learn more?
I guess I have a website, chelliespiller.com, so they could just check that out. There's bits and pieces floating around on there. I'll need to update it now, though. Oh, and there's a TED Talk on wayfinding leadership that I did. So wayfinding leadership draws on the experience of Polynesian navigators, the oceanic navigators, who journey without using any instruments, and they read the signs in the world around them. And that's very popular. We did a book. I just have so many organisations wanting wayfinding leadership, both here in New Zealand and also all around the world. I really love the fact that you can be in Cleveland, Ohio, and I can be here, and it feels very close and connected. I really appreciate the conversation, and I really love the fact that it's very emergent, and we didn't actually have a plan. So it's brought forward things that I feel needed. So thanks.
Really enjoyed my conversation with Chellie. There's a couple things that really stood out. Actually, there's many. I'm just going to highlight a few of those here. I think it's her perspective, her worldview. It is pretty incredible. And I've listened to this episode 3-4 times at this point, and new concepts, thoughts, ideas continue to emerge. And so a couple quotes that just stood out for me. I'm sure many stood out for you. Here's one. It comes back to our deep sense of belonging, to belonging not only to our families, our friends, our communities, but belonging to place and belonging to the world, to the planet. It really deepens this idea of what it means to belong. Powerful, just absolutely incredible. There's another conversation where Chellie really explores sphere intelligence versus square intelligence. She said, so I make the difference between sphere intelligence and square intelligence. In square intelligence, being cells, spreadsheets, rationalistic, logic, using these elements to dictate your path. Instead of stepping back, pausing, just having that time to reflect, look around, and tap into the wisdom within us as well. Again, just incredibly powerful. There's so many different ways that we could reflect upon and highlight elements from this episode. I hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Chellie. I'm excited to have her back to talk a little more about wayfinding leadership, to learn more of her thinking in that space. I'm going to put the link to her TED Talk on the topic so that you can begin to explore that. But again, as I said in the episode, I think there's this whole other dimension, this whole other paradigm, this whole other view of the world that has just incredible value that many cultures, in my mind, are missing. And I think that can be tragic. I think that can be toxic. I think it can be damaging if we aren't paying attention to the sphere and only the squares. Be well, everybody. Take care. As always, thank you for listening. You, my friend, have just finished another episode of Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. To get in touch with me, visit www.scottjallen.net or send me a note at scott@scottjallen.net. I can also be found on Twitter and on LinkedIn. Now, if you have feedback, I would love to hear it. And as always, thank you so much for listening to Phronesis. If you like Phronesis, I have a second podcast. It's called the Captovation Podcast. That's with an O, Captovation Podcast, where I speak with experts on the topic of designing and delivering incredible presentations. And now, Kate's twin sister, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.